are we really all one in the sense that there is no multiplicity, or is there a constant flux between the one and many, unity and multiplicity?
Yes.
Yes, right, yes.
Yes,
Well, all
to
right.
both of them.
Well, let's start with, yes, we all are one.
Except that if it's really one, there's no we.
That's right, that's right.
But we do belong to that one.
Yes, and multiplicity is a form of the one.
And the activity.
And the activity of the one. And at some sense, at some level, there's a flux between the one and the many, unity and multiplicity, in appearance, as it were.
Yeah.
But not in substance.
No. But for anything to appear, you've already broken unity.
Right.
So, ultimately, all is one. Experientially, most of the time, it seems like there are other things in the world.
Yes, well, there is this one that is constantly expressing itself.
Yeah, of course.
I think too often the notion of God creating the world is something people think happened a long time ago.
Yeah.
But at least in the doctrines of the Western monotheisms, in Christianity and Judaism and Islam, God is creating the world at every instant.
Exactly. The Orthodox have the concept of the divine essence and the energies.
Right.
And the essence is, pretty quiet. And the energies is how everything happens.
Yes, well, this is all an attempt to render into language that which is on the very border of being expressible at all, or maybe unexpressible.
Yeah.
And people grab whatever terminology is handy that they think uses it. And even Schuon, at some point says, creation is a radiation and therefore necessarily a hierarchy. But that's all modern language.
Yeah, and the hierarchy part, the fact that it appears that reality starts from pure reality and gets diluted over space and time, that's just, that's an appearance. And it doesn't necessarily mean the things that appear to be most removed are actually that much worse. They just could be run another way.
True.
Hierarchy seems natural to some, in certain ways, and it can be a concept.
Is a concept.
Yeah, and if it looks like hierarchy, you can talk about hierarchy, but never forget the underlying unity. And there's the constant flux between remembering the one and forgetting it and remembering all this other stuff in my life. So there's an alternation between the inward and the outward in our actual experience. We're not totally focused on the divine reality and in some one of these nirvikalpa samadhi or things like that. Things don't stand still. Reality doesn't change, but everything else, to the extent there is everything else, it's constantly changing. Because the process of creation continues.
Yes.
Whatever that is.
Well, I just wanted to back up there for a moment and focus on the choice of convenient language to try to describe the indescribable. And as I said, there is that work, those references in Chuan to creation as a radiation and necessarily a hierarchy. Well, I think he wants to go on from there to describe how the world should be a hierarchy, and in fact how it was a better world when there were royals and nobles and serfs and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think that hierarchy in all things should be the norm. But the fact that as you leave the source of light, it gets darker and darker.
Mm-hmm.
Where along that path do you draw a line and say, this level of the hierarchy? You can recognize that there are differences in scale, there are differences in all kinds of things, but what is it that noses the difference?
Mm-hmm. Yes,
Obviously, something that recognizes the difference between 1 and 2.
I find myself being helped out primarily from two groups of people that are on the surface different, but beneath the surface rather similar. The Neoplatonists, such as Proclus. And Proclus, when one of his students asked him, "Is God one or is God many?" Proclus responded, "There is one God and there are many gods." And I like that because for me, I believe that that's true. And Henry Corbin, actually, in a very little known letter of his to a friend, actually said he agreed with this. To say that God is one alone is in fact a limitation of God.
Exactly.
And so,
yes, right.
Yeah, and so he said that's why some of the greatest Christian and Muslim theologians have come close to polytheism, not in the gross sense, but in the positive sense of understanding that the essence of God has within itself the capability of all of multiplicity. And then that brings me to the second thing that helps me, which is a certain school of 19th and 20th century Russian Orthodox theology, as exemplified by Sergius Bulgakov, who says that the essence of God is non-hypostatic, but capable of being eternally hypostasized at any moment.
I like that.
Yeah, that's very clever.
So, and of course, there are people within the Orthodox Church that would consider him a heretic, because anytime you get into this, trying to describe the indescribable, you're at the edge of language. And so I think
you're always going to miss the mark.
You're either going to miss
right.
You're either going to miss the mark, or you're
pointing toward the mark, but
right, you're going to get so close to it that other people think you've gone out the other side.
Yeah.
But ultimately it is all language. But I think there are certain ways of talking about this that can be helpful as long as we don't spend too much time on it.
Yeah, I mean, one should address these things in a way that doesn't insist on them being a particular way, because a way of being is already in multiplicity. You just have to, you just have to remember that whatever you're thinking, whatever you're saying is really not it. But it is there nonetheless.
Yeah, so to answer the question, I would say, you answered yes. I would say yes and no.
Yeah.
I would say yes, we're all really one, and no, we're not all one. Yes, we're a multiplicity, and no, we're not a multiplicity. It depends how you look at things. Just like depending on how you look at a pyramid, you think it has a certain number of sides, but it has more sides or less sides, depending on your perspective.
Yeah, generally less.
Right, of course. So the reality is the ultimate principle. I like to call it the primordial fire. Others such as Meister Eckhart might have called it the Godhead, or others the God beyond being. But ultimately,
the ground of being,
yeah,
the infinite aesthetic continuum,
which is
exactly.
present in the heart.
Whatever you call it, it is one. And it emanates and contains all things. But within that, there is this great miracle, I don't know of a better word, called multiplicity.
Yeah.
So there's multiplicity and there's also unity. And there's this amazing thing that vacillates between the two of them. And though getting outside of the Christian tradition, Lawrence liked to call that the Holy Spirit. And I think that's actually a great term for that, as long as you're thinking of it outside of the Christian tradition, because there is this principle that keeps that dialectic between unity and multiplicity going. And there's, within us at any one moment, we have this divine fire that connects us to that ground of being and to everyone else, which is why all the mystics essentially were for the religion of love, because how could you hate that which you are?
Yeah, there's a certain sense, maybe just psychologically, that you don't hate anything without it already pre-existing, so that you know what it is and what to attribute to it. That it's already in you, which it couldn't help but be if you're part of the one.
All right, so the next one, I'm addressing this to Sheikh Al-Bashir, but City, feel free to answer it as well. And that's, how do you envision your role or the role as Sheikh in the Tariqa? And what do you strive to do differently compared to your predecessors?
Well, my focus has always been on method. And I think prior predecessors have tended to focus more on doctrine. Of course, many have been splendid academics, but for me, the spiritual life is about practice, and practice involves method. And if I bring anything to the Tariqa, it will be an interest in method and my experience with method as informed by my experience. So, I'm not going to play the role of the archetype leader, because I think that time is over. I think if I am of any service to the community in the Fuqara, it will be with individual instruction and a reliance on method, and method as used and practiced in group settings and at the Majlis and workshops and other things. And that's, I think that's a difference.
Yeah. I mean, the Sheikh can't be just one thing and be complete. There need to be as many faces of the Sheikh as there are disciples.
Yes, that's certainly true.
And there inevitably are. It's just whether or not you realize that it's a natural occurrence.
Right.
And if you can't do that, then you're not a good Sheikh.
Right. Well, I mean, I've often suspected there are those who want a Sheikh who looks the role and wears the big turban, and comes in last and insists on being spoken to in a certain way. And I think that time's over.
Well, that's an unacceptable place to stop. It may be where somebody starts, but
yes, and there's certainly a value in that too, as you mentioned it.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things are very valuable to certain types, and more broadly to beginners who need to get their feet on the ground and learn the basics and settle into a different style of life. Zeta Badria, what do you think?
Well, I think you answered it pretty well. I think you've mentioned a lot of the things you do differently. I also think, if you would have asked me 10 years ago, I would say, oh, doctrine is great. No,
Yeah.
get me wrong, doctrine is helpful, but it's something that, helps certain people to get to a certain place. but you always need practice. It doesn't matter how intellectual or non-intellectual are, everybody needs practice. And some people can go without much doctrine at all, but nobody can go without practice. And one thing I realize we need more help with in the modern world is practice. And so that's vitally important. I also think it's something, where we in general have gone wrong, and Chesterton in some of his essays, Lawrence in many of his essays laments this. Why don't we go back to this concept of, doctrine and practice being unified as they were in some of the early novels? A novel done right is more important and better than, any of the philosophical treatises, because it shows practice, it shows life directly lived. And there's this recent novel not too long ago by a Russian that I think was just done so perfectly, called Laris, about this this man who just started off, regular person, ended up becoming a holy fool. And that book, though it's fiction, had more truth in it than a lot of tomes of philosophy, because it showed life, it showed practice. There's something living in it. And what you do and want to do as a sheikh is to bring some of that life back into things and de-ossify the tariqa. And the tariqa has become very ossified. The reality is, I can't comment much on Bloomington, but from what I gather from what I've heard and from the writings, at least in the early days, Schwann, despite being a massive intellect, also cared deeply about practice. But as time went on, and especially under Dr. Nasser, though there was practice, it was very much a rigid, ceremonial, Persian Sufi kind of practice, and not something living. And, that can be a problem. And I really think there needs, especially in this day and age, to be flexibility and life in these things. And I think, focusing on a simple and vibrant practice to the exclusion of, let's say, oh, are you wearing jeans to the majlis, or are you having a turban on, is much more important, because frankly, there are essential forms, but there are also forms that can easily be discarded because they're now getting in the way.
Sure.
Right. I agree. I agree.
I think the thing is that you can really have a deep appreciation for doctrine, but the real question is, how do you experience that truth in your life? What role does it play? How does it act out in your experience?
Yes, well, doctrine should encourage method. I mean, it's beautiful, and it should call us to the truth and to beauty. Well, but it has to be alive.
Let me ask you both a question. How many times have you ever heard of someone having an experience of God while praying? On the other hand, how many of you have ever heard of people having an experience of God while reading a treatise about God?
I've had both.
I've heard both.
But, the incredibly moving insights or whatever from reading, when they're over, they're over. I mean, when that feeling is over, it's over. You hopefully retain the understanding with it, but it just, can be another moving experience, but you're not going to get that with each word doctrine.
Well, besides, I mean, there are some practices, and I'm thinking of Advaita Vedanta, where the method really is reading the texts with the master.
Yeah. Well, the scriptures have been extremely important to just about all groups, whatever their scriptures were.
That is true, and there's that similar practice within Neoplatonism as well. But these are mystical texts or sacred texts, not
Right.
modern academic texts.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
Yeah, that's
Certainly,
right.
certainly reading Ibn Arabi might get someone somewhere. Reading 1,000 books about Ibn Arabi probably won't get anyone anywhere, except a PhD.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
that's the problem with being an academic, you
Yeah.
write books about people who write books.
Ideally, it would be great to learn things about him and have that give you the impetus to go directly to it.
Yes, and pick up the practice.
Right,
Yeah.
and this is why I
Start
like
praying.
Right. This is why I like someone like Thomas Merton, because he wasn't an academic. He was an intellectual. He wrote a lot. He read a lot, but it was all in order to improve his practice, not in order to get somewhere, because he already was where he needed to be.
Yeah.
Well, he was where he needed to be in some sense, but also he realized something was missing.
Right.
Yeah.
And he went off to try to find it.
Well, and he did.
He did.
He didn't have as much time to assimilate it into his practice as he might have liked. But I do think that he found what was missing.
I guess that's another reason for writing good books. So when you find people you want to study with, you can get their attention. So you can go to the Dalai Lama and say, "You've read my books. I'd like to be a student, or perhaps there's some wisdom."
Oh yeah. Yes.
All right. Next one. How can we learn to see with the eye of the heart?
Practice.
And openness.
Yes.
I don't know if you really learn how to see the eye of the heart. You discover seeing the eye of the heart.
That's a good point. You can't learn to see with it.
Yeah. Yes. Good point.
Next one then. What role does basic health and hygiene, such as eating and sleeping well, have for the religious life?
Well, I think we have a responsibility to be well if we can. I mean, if we break a leg, we want to see a doctor, right? Problem, solution.
Yeah.
But it doesn't need to be that dramatic. That there are so many dimensions of health and hygiene that facilitate being healthy and living a healthier, happier, easier life, that make practice easier.
Yeah, and if you're not healthy, you've got distractions, an additional distraction to deal with.
Right.
And hygiene is as much for other people,
Yes, that's right.
You don't want to stink too badly, even though if you're just sitting in your study and discover you smell that way, you don't have to freak out.
And I think it's not always a simple answer. Like with something like sleep, I really like this description of Patrick Lee Fermer, who was visiting a number of monasteries, and he was staying in this monastery in France for a couple of months. And the way he described it, he said, when he arrived, he couldn't handle the lack of stimulus, so he was completely unable to sleep the first few nights. Then the next week, he did nothing but sleep for the next few days and nights. But once he got into the cycle of things, he was only sleeping around 4 or 5 hours a night, but yet had an immense amount of peace and energy, and felt like with even that small amount of sleep, he was much more energized, for lack of a better term. But, that was specifically because of the atmosphere in the monastery. And what he thought and what I think is that, you know, in that kind of atmosphere where you have a rigid sort of structure and where you don't have external stimulus, you're able to get by with, let's say, less sleep. But when you're in this, you know, modern world with all this hustle and bustle and constant stimulus, you're going to need to take care of yourself more and focus more on things like good sleep and whatnot. Because if you don't, it's going to completely exhaust you.
Well, yeah, and I think things about living in the world sometimes require a lot of energy, and hence a longer period of recuperation. But when things are simple, that doesn't take as much. But you know, one should want to have good health so that one can focus more on method or seeing the truth in life. And if every time you get quiet, you start drifting off, that's not going to help your meditation any. So, I mean, if a lack of sleep is a problem, get more. And if it's, you know, if you can do more with less sleep, well, all right. I did read recently that now some scientist, some medical person was saying, you know, we've done enough research on sleep, and we know that for an older adult, 7 hours is the right amount of sleep. You know, of course, there are individual differences, and there are times when you might want more or less, but there is no single answer, really. It's all how it plays out in your spiritual life.
Yes, that makes perfect sense.
And what about, let's say, mental health and mental hygiene? If someone's experiencing some sort of mental health problem, I've personally heard a lot of people, religious people, say, well, I need to go to my priest or my sheikh for that. But isn't there a place for, let's say, seeing a medical doctor or a psychiatrist, because maybe they're best trained for that and not your priest or sheikh?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there are many times I've encouraged people to do just that, because with a therapist, they could overcome in 6 months what it might take 16 years to overcome without working on it with somebody who knows how to help that particular problem.
Right. I mean, psychology is external to who we really are. And there are a lot of things in life that can be dealt with on the level of life. And one state of mind can be in that category sometimes. Otherwise, you can fall into the trap of saying, oh, I have this psychological problem because I'm not spiritual enough. I've failed on, you know. Let's keep things in their right place.
It's all about finding the right person for you. Yeah, there's a lot of bad psychiatrists out there that follow questionable ideologies, but there's also a lot of bad priests and sheikhs out there that are underqualified and follow questionable ideologies. So, you know, find someone that is right for you and take it from there. And hey, there's actually a lot of positive developments happening. I mean, psychedelic therapy and psychiatry and psychology, that's a huge positive development.
Yeah. It only took them, what, 60 years, 65 years, whatever. But, you know, it is what it is. And I'm glad they're getting around to it.
My only shock there is that with as much information is out there on how immensely helpful these things are, the fact that so many people are still against it, that industries against it, that governments are against it, still is really, really just ridiculous, because
Yep.
it's just can be so helpful for so many people.
Well, I think there are a lot of people that are afraid of other people's states of consciousness, and they feel threatened if you experience things too differently. If you step into a psychedelic experience where you might be taken far away from what you learned in church. And also, self-medication is in general still frowned upon. But even in a clinical setting, it's funny that they have to have all these randomized controlled trials, and they are valuable. But it doesn't take those to discover the benefit of these substances.
But the interesting thing there is, and I think I've mentioned this before, I was sitting at a table in Berlin with a couple of people, and I was mentioning, I don't use drugs. I don't smoke, never smoked, never drank, don't drink, but psychedelics have been incredibly helpful for me. And then some of these people, they're like, yeah, I've used everything. I've used cocaine, I've used heroin, I've used like all these things, but psychedelics, that stuff scares me. I wouldn't ever use that. And wow, that's interesting. It's like you're afraid coming into touch with your deeper self.
Well, and they're afraid of having an experience that is too far away what they're comfortable with. And the fact that you might have an experience that is fearful, or you might have an experience where you can't even talk to normal people. It's that loss of control fear. But I don't know how much control you keep once you start taking a lot of those other things either. Control is an illusion most of the time.
Yes, true enough.
Not that it doesn't have any meaning, it's just that it isn't always what we think it is.
True enough.